Well, so
Yeah.
here's an example.
Okay.
Just Kant prescinds not from nature.
What page are we on?
Top of 47. There are many examples, but I just
Yeah.
happen to
Right.
pick this one.
Near the top of 47?
Very top line.
Oh, yeah, right.
And so I'm wondering what the object is there, unless maybe it's just.
Oh, well, I guess, yeah. Yeah. If I understand what you mean by object, then the object would be, in the context, the transcendental form of natural reason. It goes back to the formulation of my formulation of what Thomas creates.
Right.
And then earlier we've said in the Descartes chapter that Descartes, as it were, takes that transcendental form of natural reason and prescinds from nature. In other words, so in Descartes I'm left with a transcendental form of reason that originally, as it were, in its formation in Thomas was, which originally allowed for no possibility of prescinding nature or prescinding from nature. And now what I'm saying in today's assignment, which I really enjoyed rereading, is that Kant does a kind of prescinding analogous to what I say Descartes is doing, but he does it, as it were, in the other direction.
Yeah.
He takes the same transcendental form of natural reason, and this ties in with the other major idea that's developed in today's assignment, that the immediacy of the knowledge of the world as part and parcel of the immediacy of the knowledge of the self-conscious I. That's what Kant does to eliminate all of, as it were, Descartes' problems.
Yeah, okay. So, okay.
Was there another question? I thought there were two.
No, the other question is very simple. Would you just, for a rusty old historian,
It's very dangerous when it's a really simple question.
just quickly say the difference between transcendental idealism, empirical realism, and transcendental.
Oh, yeah.
I'm almost getting it.
Well, I start off that discussion, again in today's assignment, by characterizing Thomas. I don't know whether anybody else does this. I mean, you know what I'm saying? It has never stopped me before. Right? So, that if I look at Thomas through a Kantian lens, then Thomas turns out to be a transcendental realist, meaning that for him, in Kantian terms, for Thomas, time and space are a given, really given. They're not forms of the transcendental consciousness as they offer Kant, you see. So in that sense, he's a transcendental realist. But he is also, unlike Descartes, who follows upon him, he is also, Thomas, an empirical realist. That is, to put it really simply, Thomas has no doubt either about the fundamental forms of time and space, right? Nor does he have any doubt about the existence of objects outside of, so to speak, the mind. And then Descartes takes from Thomas the transcendental real. I mean, it's somewhat ironic. He takes, now of course, it occurred to me in rereading this text that, you know, you could write another few chapters on this point, right? It's a little, you know, it's a cryptic treatment, but essentially, I think it's fair to say what the text says, that Descartes basically takes what I'm calling the transcendental realism of Thomas. That is, he does not have any, I think with the possible modifications I put it in the text, but let me put it this way. He fundamentally accepts the realism of time in his consciousness. He has no doubt about that. And I think it's a little bit ambiguous. This was my thought on rereading the text. It's at least ambiguous whether Descartes has any doubt about space. I think he probably must have a doubt about space because I don't think he can make a distinction between the things that exist outside of his res cogitans, res extensa, if there isn't implicitly in that a doubt about space. So I think what I'm calling in the text, that is Descartes' transcendental realism, is perhaps complicated. But if you take, as I think we do subsequently in Western thought, it becomes more and more clear that if I have to choose between time and space, the ultimate inclination is to reduce space to time. So the priority of the temporal consciousness, or the temporality of consciousness in Husserl and even in modern contemporary physics.
Space to time?
Yeah.
Time. In physics, it's surely the other way.
No,
Time is reduced to space.
I don't think so. Well, it depends on who's your physicist here. My authority would be
Well-
Hawking, but I don't. Yeah,
No.
space lines are timelines.
But time is dimensionalized as a fourth dimension of space.
It's a fourth dimension, but whether it's a fourth spatial dimension
Well,
in
it's-
20th century physics, I would say no offhand. I would say that there is a fourth spatial dimension such that in the thinking now occurring, all four dimensions would be reducible to time itself. But I think in physics, that fourth dimension, the time is not a spatial
We
dimension.
go into this, I don't
Okay,
say at all.
but anyway, that would get us, so let's just bracket that.
Yeah, yeah.
The point being that, so to the extent to which there is the tendency in modern thought, ultimately in one way or another, to make space dependent upon time, then I think in that sense you can maintain what I say here that Descartes is a transcendental realist. But I'm willing to concede that it's a complicated and matter that needs further discussion. But it's clear to Kant, and Kant makes the point, that's what gets me involved in it, that Descartes is an empirical idealist. That is, he doubts the existence of things outside of his mind. Right? So in that sense, he's an idealist, not a realist, right? But his idealism, Descartes' idealism, from Kant's perspective, is confined to the things existing outside the mind. Kant describes himself as a transcendental idealist who is, however, so he reverses Descartes, and this is a more technical and less poetic version of the Copernican revolution. In other words, where Descartes is a transcendental realist who's an empirical idealist, Kant is a transcendental idealist who's an empirical realist. Now, of course, it's not that simple, and Kant is at pains to show us it's not that simple, because his so-called empirical realism requires him to establish the immediacy of the existence of the world as part and parcel of the inner consciousness of Descartes. So I don't know if that in any way helps.
Yeah, it does.
Gives you a framework.
Yeah.
We'll see more of it hopefully when we get into the actual text. Okay.
I
Yes.
have a question,
Sure.
and I apologize if you've already discussed it, I didn't hear all the tapes. Without contact,
Right.
originating in Augustine, knowing without contact, does that mean without
Oh.
self-consciousness? Does it mean?
No, it means something. It goes back to the fundamental notion that the Aristotelian divine mind knows itself, and in an act of knowing in which the knower and the known are identical, by being in contact with itself, by touching itself, as he says in the text quoted, I think, in chapter 1. And then the without contact idea. The middle historical term in the development of that notion would be Plotinus, who raises the one above the knower in the sense of the nous, the secondary god, as what in Aristotle would have been the prime mover, now becomes a secondary god, and the one is the act of knowing of a knowledge that is not its own knowledge, but the knowledge of another. And so, in effect, what I'm saying is that implicitly in Plotinus's notion of the one, which is in some paradoxical sense an act of knowledge, but not an act of its own knowledge, we have a notion of a divine act of knowing, which is not in contact with itself. And then I apply that notion to Augustine, who takes the creator God, the God who creates the world ex nihilo, which for Augustine the specific content of which is the Trinitarian structure. And what I'm saying in effect is that he, what you might call the blank, that the Platinian one needs to be some kind of a blank, some kind of a formless form, right? Some kind of ineffability beyond predication. But I say earlier in the text that in Augustine, as it were, the ineffable is spoken about. He has now the grounds for doing that ultimately in the inseparability of his thinking from his faith. Okay, so that inextricable, I don't know, it's quite a circularity, but that inextricable circuitry of faith and thinking in Augustine permits him to as it were, speak of a Godhead which is at least analogous to the Platinian one in being beyond contact with itself, but unlike the Platinian one, is a knower, is a mind that knows itself and knows things outside of itself as the creator, right? So that the background to your the background to the issue that you're raising is the notion in this text that in Augustine in the Trinity we have a divine intellect which knows itself without contact with itself. So that already you have a kind of openness, right? So the fact that the three persons of the Trinity are the one essence, the one being that God is a kind of evidence. It's a kind of articulation of the fact that we don't have that kind of escape from perception that this is an ironic way of putting it, that takes place in contact. In other words, in the identity of the feeling and the felt, right, is an identity that in which I can't really distinguish the feeling and the felt as such. I can mentally, of course. I'm talking physically. I can't distinguish my feeling, what I'm feeling, from what is felt, right? That's fine for Aristotle. What I'm saying is analogously, intellectually, there's a space, as it were, speaking of space, as it were, there's a space opened up in the divine mind, in the notion of the Trinity, where there is a kind of imaging and a reflection. It's an infinitely perfect reflection that the Father has of himself in his understanding of himself, which understanding of himself is so perfect that it's a second person. In other words, that it is equally the one God that the Father is. It's not, you see, so it's, and then the relationship between the two, the love, if you want, of the Father for his understanding of himself, which is his Son, is equally perfect. It gives us that third person. But what I'm getting at is that little dance, as I think the ancient fathers, some of them, the Greek fathers, like to speak of it as a kind of dancing around of the three persons of the Trinity, the fact that they can all, as it were, be there dancing around in the oneness of the Godhead, in their distinctness. However difficult it is for Augustine to nail down that distinctness, he finally calls it relations, right? They are, three persons are really three relations, technically speaking, or categorically speaking. But nevertheless, there are these distinct, I guess the simplest way I can put it, there are these differences in the unity of the Godhead which are there precisely for Augustine, without being lost sight of, right? So in that sense, we don't have that kind of the losing sight of the distinction between the knower and the known that we have in the Aristotelian notion of intellect as contact with itself.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Very,
Does
very
that help?
helpful. Thank you. Yeah.
All right. Any other questions? All right. If there are no other questions for the moment, let's go back. I think we have pretty much gotten to 30 and 31, where I was emphasizing, and which is the issue, by the way. I mean, it's important to appreciate Descartes, right? That and it comes up again in today's reading, because the question of the meaning of the fifth argument in Descartes' Meditations and the characterization of it as an ontological argument that becomes an issue when we get to Kant and to Hegel. So I was emphasizing last time, just in the immediate Cartesian context, on page 30, at the bottom 30 and over on 31, that, as I think I put it, the argument in Meditation 3 is a complex argument. It's not simply that I can derive the existence of God from the idea of God that I have. It's not. If that were the case, it would be the. And I really have to say, Bart. I quote Bart in today's assignment. If that really were the case, then we would have the so-called ontological argument. The point being that, as Bart points out, it's even dubious that Anselm, you say, ultimately derives the existence of God from the idea that he has, as if it wasn't important that he got that idea from the God whose existence he's proving, right? So analogously in Descartes, he does not deduce or infer or demonstrate the existence of God from the mere fact, you see, that the idea of infinite being requires that being to exist, right? But the hook upon which all of that hangs is the question of where did he get the idea? To say, if he could have created, as it were, in his own mind, if he could be the author of the idea of God as infinite being, right, then it would not be possible for him to demonstrate the existence of God from that idea, because it's his own idea, and he can't. How could he go from his mind to something outside of, as it were, his mind? Which, by the way, is his fundamental problem, right? That's the fundamental project of the Meditations. Is if I withdraw into the recesses of my own consciousness, is there any way and if I can get to the indubitable certitude that whatever I'm doing, whether I'm thinking or drinking, I am, you say, if that is immediately and undeniably clear to Descartes, okay, that still doesn't solve his ultimate scientific project, despite my friend Jim's baseless allegations of the contrary. It's clear that Descartes' whole project is oriented toward establishing the existence of the external world, because in being able to move step by step without a misstep, in principle, I mean, this is the principle of the project. If I can go from an absolutely indubitable foundation, being careful that at each step away from that foundation, you see, I don't introduce anything dubious, right? If I carefully follow my way, I can eventually get back to my ultimate project here, and that is to the world which is the object of science or the object of philosophy. But I can do so now, always tying it back to a undoubtable foundation. All right. So what I'm getting at is that the proof of the idea of God, the proof of the existence of God in Meditation 3, has the analogous problem. If he could have been the author of the idea of God as infinite being, if he could be the author of that, then in other words, if it's a product of his mind, of his thinking as a res cogitans, then there'll be no way to go from what is true in mente to what is true in re, as Thomas Aquinas would put it, right? What is true in the mind may or may not be true in the mind, but it doesn't follow that because it's true in the mind that it is true in reality. That's the basic Thomistic position. And Descartes has not abandoned that position, because I see now how all these technical terms take on some flesh here. So if I say that Descartes is, even if in somewhat complicated sense, a transcendental realist, to say he's got some very fundamental tie with Thomas, and he's in agreement as a consequence of that fundamental tie of a transcendental realism, that I cannot assume that because something is true, that I have an idea of something that it exists, right? So what he needs to demonstrate to himself is that the idea of God that he has of infinite being is something that he could not be the author of, right? That, in other words, the only way he could have this idea is that if there is such an infinite being who has implanted that idea in him and I say him now, you have to be very careful, in him this res cogitans, not him with the body, right? In him the mind has implanted it in him, and then there's certain ambiguity, which is a creative ambiguity, implanted it in the mind in such a way, since the mind is incorporeal, that it is what the mind is. In other words, the mind is, in some sense, the idea of God, right? So in knowing itself and knowing the idea of God, it knows itself to be absolutely a creature, is what it comes down to, right? It's only all right. So now the issue there that it's going to work its way up in today's assignment is, all right. So that's an argument from causality. In other words, what he's saying is, for any idea I find in my mind, there must be a cause adequate to produce it. Okay, and there are two ways in which something can cause an idea to be. It can be either formally the cause of that idea. In other words, that there is just as much reality in the cause of the idea as the idea represents there to be, or there can be an immanent causality, that is, God can cause me to have ideas of other creatures, which is going to be very handy, by the way, by the time we get through the meditations, you see. An immanent cause, such as God, who is an infinitely, sheerly immanent cause, can cause there to be the ideas of things less real, as it were, than itself, but nevertheless real. Okay. But the key thing there, setting aside the distinction between formal and immanent causality, is that it's an argument from causality, and that goes again to the transcendental realism description of Descartes. Is that Descartes takes it for granted that that an effect must have a cause, and if I can demonstrate that only such a cause could produce such an effect, then I can demonstrate that that cause exists. If I assume the existence of the effect, all of that assumes, as Kant points out, and this is Kant pulls the rug absolutely out from under this. All of that assumes that causality. How can I put it? Causality in the realm of the mind, right? I want to say, to put it simply, can be trusted. In other words, what Kant wants to do is he wants to reduce causality as a method for establishing knowledge. He wants to reduce it to the natural realm, right? In other words, causality is only operative scientifically in the realm of nature. So again, to go back to some of the earlier opening questions, to say, when I say that Kant takes the transcendental form of natural reason and in a way contrary to Descartes, prescinds not from nature, prescinds from reason. Right? So Kant, it's all highly paradoxical, okay, you understand? But because that nature that he does not prescind from, which he is immediately certain of in his self-consciousness, is nevertheless a nature which has been reduced to what he calls substantia phenomenon, right? From it's been reduced to phenomenal substance and distinguished from noumenal substance, right? So it's a little bit tricky here. There's a trick going on, but nevertheless, allowing for the distinction between phenomenon and noumenon, what Kant is doing is that he's saying, hey, we have no reason to doubt our natural experience. We don't doubt our natural experience because it comes part and parcel with our knowledge of ourselves. It's immediately there. The world is there, and we ought not to doubt it. Do you see? Paradoxically, of course, he doubts the efficacy of reason. Do you see? And that's the word I was looking for before. Not so much the trustworthiness of reason, but it's scientific efficacy. To say it takes on a purely formal efficacy for science. It does not lead to the knowledge of an object, a scientific object, nor does it lead to the knowledge of the being of any of its ideas, to say, which are part and parcel of it. So the idea of God, the idea of immortality, the idea of freedom, all of these fundamental ideas that are intrinsic for Kant to the nature of reason, he doesn't deny that the ideas are there. He said, I just can't go from those ideas to the being corresponding to those ideas. So to come back to the one at issue, if I have an idea of God, as Descartes does, and as Kant does, to say, if I'm Kant prescinding from reason, I cannot use an argument based on causality, which he is saying only works in the natural realm, to say, I can't use an argument from causality to establish the being or the existence of the reality represented by, in this case, the idea of God. So I've gotten a little ahead of myself, but on 30 and 31, I'm just emphasizing what I call the complex nature of the argument. It's not in any way an ontological argument, and it calls into question, as we'll see, I think, in today's assignment, the accuracy of calling even the argument in the fifth meditation an ontological argument. But we'll save that. Then on page 31, what I'm talking about there in the top part of 31, is that the idea of the infinite here is an idea of positive infinity, and I think I'm going to save that because that comes up in today's assignment. So let me read the middle paragraph. That might do it. Why doesn't Descartes begin with the privation of the positive and understand the positive to be the privation of itself? Why doesn't Descartes say that light is the negation of darkness, the negation of an absence of light, the negation of light? Why doesn't he say that the infinite is the negation of the finite? There I say it. Why doesn't he say that it's the negation of the infinite? Some wag says because he's not Hegel. Exactly. Descartes is still this side of establishing the substantial reality of the world. But the knowledge he has of his own being, he has in the immediacy of the natural light, in which it is perceived clearly as not nothing. And that natural light issue comes up again in today's assignment, right? Where when I say that Kant prescinds from reason as over against the prescinding from nature in Descartes, in effect, what Kant is doing in prescinding from reason in my language, again in my analysis, is prescinding from the natural light. The key word there, not from nature, because we're saying he's a nature guy, right? But it's from the natural light. In other words, that there is a light that illuminates the created mind. A light, in other words, that I can rely upon as a guide to knowing what's what, right? Descartes has no doubt about the fact that so that natural light is a kind of a metaphor which was developed in the Middle Ages. And I guess probably in effect goes back certainly to Augustine in principle. I don't know whether they used the term, but that notion of the light in the interior of the soul. But what it is, if I put it in Thomistic terms, it's a natural light, meaning it's a participation in the divine light. So it's a metaphorical way of speaking of what Thomas speaks of ontologically as the participation of the creature in the essay, in the to be of the creator, right? Such a real participation that it has a certain being of its own, all right? So what I'm getting at is that if we stick to the light metaphor, the light goes out in Kant, right? That is, the light goes out because I can no longer go from my natural experience, or I can no longer relate my natural experience I can no longer understand my natural experience as a participation, you say, in the being of this infinite being. Okay? I have that idea, but I've short-circuited it when I get to Kant. Okay. The mode in which the perception of the infinite is in the eye prior to the perception of the finite is precisely its being the immediacy of the natural light. Its being, in effect, the extra-logical fact of the eyes not being nothing. Its being, in effect, the infinite negation of the finite. So I'm playing here, and it comes up again, I guess in today's assignment explicitly when we get to Hegel. And in the beginning of the Hegel chapter, I'm doing this, but what I'm calling your attention here is looking at Descartes. In other words, I'm kind of reading backwards, just as I'm explaining Descartes from a Kantian perspective as a transcendental realist and so forth, you say, and Thomas from a Kantian perspective as a transcendental empirical realist. So analogously, I'm looking at Descartes, as it were, from a Hegelian perspective, looking back at Descartes, and instead of what we find in looking back from Hegel, and instead of, as we find in Hegel, as we'll see again in today's assignment, instead of the infinite being the negation of the finite, or otherwise phrased, the negation of the negation understood of the infinite, you see, what we have in Descartes is the negation of the finite. That is, the infinite is not the negation of the negation. The infinite is not the negation of the finite. The infinite is the negation of the finite. Do you say it is the It is the yeah. All right, I'll stop there because the language gets hairy. But you get the idea. So in other words, and that leads me to say that there's a kind of suitability of the infinite and the finite in Descartes. I think I said that in today's assignment. That is to say, what I'm trying to convey there is that one is left with the, I don't think it's the right word, not so much just the pairing, but as it were I think you could put it this way to get the idea across, something like the coexistence of the infinite and the finite in Descartes. You see, he coexists with the creator, which, by the way, is a very Thomistic idea, really. You see, I mean, he profoundly coexists with the creator in a way that goes beyond Thomas and alters Thomas. But that's the notion. If I participate in being in Thomistic terms in such a way as to have a certain being of my own, you see, then that's another way of saying that if I have a certain being of my own, even though I'm created, having a certain being of my own, I have a kind of, I'm there. I don't have to get out of the way of the infinite for the infinite to be. As we see at the beginning of today's chapter, in order for the infinite to be, the finite has to completely self-negate itself. You see, it has to evaporate. It has to vanish in the That's Hegel. So, in other words, the natural light has to vanish in the divine light in Hegel. If I update that language, you see. Yeah, see. So that says so much about Hegel and Kant. Right? If I'm right, that in Kant, the light goes out, right? That is, the natural light goes out. Well, Hegel's not really in disagreement with that, except that it's incomplete, as everything else is in Kant for Hegel, right? In other words, it's a halfway house to the truth. It's not just that the natural light goes out in Kant, which leaves him hanging there, you see, with his world of noumenal substance and his world of phenomenal substance, should I say, with his world of moral freedom and his world of natural necessity, you see, a world of freedom, therefore, over against a world of causality. He's got this radical dualism, but Hegel, of course, Hegel's basic posture is that if he had only recognized, if he had only had he only had the perception to follow through on some of his incomplete insights, Kant, if he had only been able to unify or synthesize these two poles, then he would have been Hegel, right? But what I'm getting at, what I'm trying to get at, to use the natural light metaphor again, is yes, the light goes out in Kant, but the light goes out and it leaves Kant hanging, or it leaves the noumenal world there, in a certain sense, hanging off the horizon, you see. Whereas what Hegel does is say, yes, the light goes out because it submerges itself, it disappears in the divine light. So that the whole, it's almost as if the whole of the, if in Kant there's a contrast or a contradiction or a alternative between the natural light that Descartes had and the prescinding from reason, but the immediate knowledge of the substantial reality of nature qua appearance, one way of understanding what Hegel's about is finding in that world of substantial appearance the world that Kant establishes as immediately real in self-consciousness. What Hegel wants to do is to see in that the divine light. Right? He wants to see in that not the Cartesian natural light, not a participation alongside of participation by the creature in the creator's being, which, as it were, is a kind of fitting of the creature to the creator, a kind of coexistence, but rather a complete submerging of what otherwise would appear to be the independent existence of the natural world, complete submerging of that in the divine light, in the divine, or in the infinite being, or in the absolute, as Hegel might put it. Okay, I jumped that little ahead, but it's okay. All right, I emphasize here because it comes up again in today's assignment at the bottom of 31. Quoting Descartes, he says, "It is absolutely necessary to conclude from this alone that I am and possess the idea of being absolutely perfect, that is of God, and of a being absolutely perfect, that is of God, that his existence is most clearly demonstrated. There remains only the inquiry as to the way in which I received this idea from God, for I have not drawn it from the senses, nor is it even presented to me unexpectedly, as is usual with ideas of sensible objects, when these are presented or appear to be presented to the external organs of the senses. It is not even a pure production or fiction of my mind, for it is not in my power to take from or add to it, and consequently there remains but remains the alternative that it is innate, in the same way as the idea of myself, which I was kind of alluding to before, right? The idea of myself and the idea of God are there as given by God, because really Descartes' idea of himself ultimately is his idea of himself as the idea of God, right? As the representation of the divine, which is Descartes' way of saying what I'm saying in effect on a broader scale, namely that he, in some sense, appropriates the transcendental form of natural reason to self-consciousness, again, prescinding in the process from nature. All right, and so he says, and in truth, it is not to be wondered at that God, at my creation, implanted this idea in me, that it might serve, as it were, for the mark of the workman, nota artificis, impressed on his work. And it is not also necessary that the mark should be something different from the work itself. You see? Now that's especially the case. I mean, Descartes can get away with that technically because the work here is the res cogitans, the immaterial, non-corporeal thinking thing that he is, the thinking substance that he is. I think I alluded briefly last time, I don't know whether you caught it, to the fact that Thomas makes a similar statement, namely that the image of God is present in man, but Thomas says it need not be present in every part of man. So in other words, now Thomas doesn't have the problem that Descartes has, right? He doesn't create two substances, body and soul. You know? He's not doing that. He has another kind of problem, but that's another problem. That's another issue. So he has a kind of Aristotelian-like unity of substance of body and soul. Thomas does, with problems that Aristotle doesn't have. But nevertheless, what I'm getting at is that Descartes would have understood, in reading somebody like Thomas, he would have understood that the image of God, the idea of God in this case, for Thomas need only extend to the human soul, to the human mind, because after all, remember, God is a spirit, and qua spirit, or man qua spirit is this soul, right? So, okay, so he has a precedent for this idea of the mind or the soul being itself the image of God, as in effect he says. Okay. All right, and I emphasize on page 32, going over this language which I introduced, I guess from Peirce, wherever it was, of what's going on in the syllogism is that the predicate of the predicate, the nota note, is the nota, the predicate of the thing itself in the syllogism, that in Descartes, in effect, is substituted for the predicate of the predicate, is substituted a person, the artifices, right? In other words, so in that Latin phraseology there in the middle of the second paragraph on 32, but nota artifices is nota res itself. In other words, the predicate of the creator, you could understand here, you see, is the predicate of the thing itself, in this case the creature, right? So in Descartes, what becomes explicit is that I can predicate of the creature the predicate of the creator, right? So, and I think I said, I connected this with the notion that in Thomas, who probably would not have put it quite that directly, there is nevertheless the notion that in having a certain being of its own, which certain being of its own is there because of its participation in the ipsum esse, the being itself of the creator, that the creature is at least implicitly, I mean, not full-blown in Thomas, certainly not, okay, because there are other restrictions on his thinking, but nevertheless there at core, and this is, I think, is what Descartes is taking advantage of, what modernity itself is taking advantage of. There is at core in that participation which leaves the creature with a certain being of its own, which is what I'm getting at, which being of its own, which being its own, something to be predicated, which is predicated of the creator. I'm saying implicitly in Thomas, the creature is a creator, right? You could say by participation, but that notion of the creature being a creator is not going to become explicit until I get to Descartes, because in order to take advantage of that, I'm missing something in Thomas. In other words, the creature who is implicitly a creator in Thomas is not going to be explicitly a creator until Descartes takes the transcendental form of natural reason and prescinds nature, or prescinds from nature. In other words, and which in effect, until Descartes makes explicit in that prescinding from nature the analogy of the creativeness of the creature to the creativeness of the creator. Do you see what I'm saying? So that move, that it's not just, I mean, that's all he was doing, right? You know, in a certain sense. It's not just that he doubts everything he can doubt. He is doubting everything he can doubt. And it is true that he can doubt everything, including the fact that there's a world, and he has a body in the world, and so forth and so on, even though he ultimately can't doubt that he is, as long as he's doubting. That's all he'd be certain of immediately. But it's not an accident, it's not incidental that what he's able to doubt, to say ultimately, is the creation. You know what I'm saying? So it's only, see what I'm saying, formally, insofar as he's able to be and to doubt the creation, well, he's formally in a divinely predicative mode, right? See, I mean, the creator is independently of the reality of the creation. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a creation ex nihilo. Right? Otherwise, we'd have an emanation. Do you see what I'm getting at? Okay, so even though Descartes' project is very limited, very modest, right? There are profound implications, right? The profoundest implication is that in that doubt, in his being able to survive doubting everything apart from the immediate certainty of his own being while he's doubting, he puts himself formally in the place. Right? You see, he's trying to actually apply that, you might say, concretely and productively to his scientific relationship to the world. Along those lines, his freedom of choice, his will, is that aspect of his being a res cogitans, which in a certain sense is most like the creator, right? Because the creator has an infinite mind and an infinite will, or putting it another way, has a mind without limitations and has a will without any limitations, qua will. Right? That's the point that Descartes is making. And I, Descartes, or the res cogitans, I have a will without any limitations. I am perfectly free to choose this or that. And in that respect, qua freedom of will, I am no different. I find in myself something no different from the divine quality of will. In that sense, I am most especially in the image of God. My problem, Descartes is saying throughout this passage, but only the Creator can make the this human being, right? The thisness, the actual, we might say later on, the absolutely concrete existence of this creature. That absolute thisness is what Thomas attributes to the creative causality. Now, so I'm thinking, but that creative causality which pertains to the thisness, that which distinguishes this from all other thises, right, transcends genus and species. But genus and species are the property of what? What are the...
Of all, first move in phenomenology and sense certainty is that he says this is a universal. That this is a universal, right?
Yeah.
So he's going to get rid of all of these guys who want to say there's the world of sensibility is a world of richness, variegated, all of this stuff, because in fact there is no variegation there except mediated by universals, and in fact thisness itself is a universal.
Mm-hmm.
So there's already this in there, this enormous furious whirlpool of screwiness about exactly this question of particularity, individuality, and its relationship to difference and distinctness, so that the postmodern return to Hegel is precisely on this question through linguistics. That linguistics, similarly, by multiplying the idea that particularity comes through difference. So, all right, that's one.
That's very good, because that'll help me. That helps me clarify my thought about something I want to say later.
Okay, one. Two, this will sound weird, the dis in distinct. In English, there are two disses. There's a dis that's that negates, and there's a dis that intensifies.
In a certain sense, qua creature create the world, but he wants to do so qua creature. He doesn't need to be God in order to do what he wants to do. So when I get to Descartes, this elevation of the infinite above limitation, you see, is a nice and positive way, an affirmative way of defining God as that being who is free from the limitations of nature. Right? So in a certain sense, and I mean, really nice to sit down and talk to Hegel about this, because he's got otherwise some profound arguments on this point. But in effect, to say, in effect, and this really would, I would like to hear Hegel's comeback. In effect, Hegel, much in a very un-Hegelian way, he's starting with the